Thank you, Nanette, and thank you to the Young Greens for this really kind invitation. Let me just say a little bit first about myself and then War on One, because I sound very dull when I was like, oh, he's on the board of Friends of the Earth and Amnesty and blah, blah, blah. My background is as an activist, both here in the UK and globally. I started out in the anti-racist movement in the early 80s, and I've been involved in many social justice movements. And I've got to say, I used to say I'm a belated environmentalist, in the sense that that wasn't how my politics was formed. My politics was formed mainly around economic and racial and social justice issues. But having gone through the many different movements, particularly movements around global economic justice, it was clear that on every fight that we were fighting, that and every victory that we were potentially winning, that climate was going to be the ticking time bomb that could derail either everything or was exasperating every inequality that existed in the world. I now work for War on Want, and if you don't know War on Want, do have a look at us. We're often said to be the most radical charity in the UK. We were founded by the Labour movement many decades ago, in fact, against the war against Korea, hence our name. The only war worth fighting is the war against want. We campaign both here in the UK, and we work together with partners in the global south. We work on everything from extractivism to workers' rights, particularly around garment industry and fast food workers and low-paid workers. We work around the right to food. We work with shack dwellers in South Africa, with communities basically in resistance. And we were always, when we were set up not to be like any other charity. We were set up basically not to do project work, but to focus on the root causes of inequality, poverty, and injustice. And throughout the decades, we were probably the first and the only charity that stood with the anti-colonial movements. We were explicitly supported the anti-imperialist movements and liberation struggles from everybody from South Africa, the anti-apartheid movement in South Africa, to movements against dictatorships in Latin America, and to now we do so on Palestine. But we work right across the board, and we also build power in the UK, and so we work a lot with movements here in the UK. We were together with the Bakers Union behind the McStrike campaign, and we helped coordinate the COP26 coalition, and obviously now much delayed into 2021. So our perspective is always shaped by the realities of our movements in the global south. And we've always been intent on trying to draw the connections between the struggles around environmental justice, injustice, economic injustices, and social injustices. And we believe in that the only power we have is the power of our movements. And, of course, most of us spent most of our lives trying to build that movement of movements. How could we connect? And climate does allow us that opportunity, and allows us a lens in which to look at the world and recognize why we're here. And I remember Greta Thunberg, the climate activist you all know, when she spoke to the US Congress, she said this quote, and I quite like it, so I'm going to just repeat it. She said, "We need dreams. We cannot live without dreams, but there's a time and place for everything. But we're telling ourselves bedtime stories that soothe us and make us go back to sleep." And I think that's really relevant, particularly in this moment we're living in, when now more than ever before, we see the glaring inequalities of neoliberal capitalism and the reality of the corona pandemic, the inequalities that it exposes in who's being impacted and how that impact takes place, the difference between the realities in the global north and the global south, and of course, the realities of it's compounding already the glaring inequalities of the climate crisis. I remember when I first got involved with the environment movement and the climate movement, I was always told this analogy, and and I keep repeating it because it really struck me at the time, and it still continues to strike me now. And when I was talked about, that the center of climate has to be the argument around climate justice, and and justice. And I was always told, well, no, climate is something that affects all of us, right? And there was this much beloved analogy in the mainstream environment movement. They used to say, we're all on the Titanic together and we're heading towards the proverbial iceberg and it struck it, and, you know, and this is a reality for all of us. And I was always like, that's, whilst we might all be on the Titanic, the reality is we have very, very different experiences. And on the top deck of the Titanic to this day are the elites and the citizens, overwhelmingly of the global north, still sipping cocktails, still listening to the orchestra, thinking there's going to be some miracle answer. And in the hold of the Titanic are the peoples of the global south, black, brown people, who are already drowning. And when they try and escape, they find that the hold is barred shut. And I think that, to me, is a really important how we center that reality. And you know, so I don't need to say to you, because I know all of you are involved in I presume in climate justice and the Young Greens, but it's important, let's just say something about the climate science before I start talking about the climate and colonialism and capitalism. So we all can see the world that we're facing, right? Killer droughts, floods, famines happening everywhere in the world. And these are all happening at, of course, a 1 degree warming, when we were told that they would happen at 2 degrees. And a decade ago, the climate justice movement, particularly movements from the global south, we used to argue that temperatures need to be kept well below 1 degree because there was no safe temperature level. And the mainstream environment movement used to argue for temperatures to kept at 2 degrees. And with that, and we again showed the reality which shapes how people look at climate and climate change. Now, we don't need to be a rocket climate scientist. We have all seen the pictures and the realities of what happened in Puerto Rico, what happened in Dominica, flattened by hurricanes. And it's just worth noting about these different experiences, because often now, of course, people talk about these climate impacts in the global north as well. And of course, they are devastating. And they do impact people's lives and livelihoods, but the realities are very, very different. In Dominica, that one hurricane, you know, caused damage worth about 224% of that country's GDP. In Mozambique, if you remember last year when the 2 cyclones hit, you know, 1 million people were left on the brink of starvation, not because of the cyclones themselves, because we, over decades, have gutted Mozambique's ability to be able to actually provide any services to its own citizens. And so the reality of Mozambique, which was unable to feed its own people, was that it had to come to the City of London and beg for more debt-creating loans, simply to deal with the impacts of the climate crisis. And you might remember, and of course, these days, every week seems like a lifetime ago. But last summer, when the droughts hit India, in India's 5th biggest city, Chennai, ran out of water. And it's now, in the next decade, it's predicted that 40% of India's 1.2 billion people will be without access to fresh water. And I say those because the reality of that climate experience and reality of climate impacts is so profoundly different. So the climate crisis is not something that's going to happen in the future. For many people in the global south, it's already been a reality, and it's been a reality for many, many years. And of course, many people were, particularly the new surge in climate activism, were inspired by or horrified by the IPCC report. And I think it's just really important that we say something about that climate science, because often people, I think, take very, very different readings of that climate science. Now, you know, the IPCC report talked about why it was important that we don't breach the 1.5 degree guardrail, and talked about the feedback loops that would happen. It talked about the stresses and the impacts on food production, on more frequent and more violent extreme weather events. It talked about how the economies of the global south would be devastated, that the impacts would be greater than the financial crisis, that each of these crises would be much more profound than anything that's ever happened before. And whilst it's true, and of course, it sent shockwaves through the global north and inspired new movements, Fridays for Future, Extinction Rebellion, etc. You know, for the poorest and movements in the global south, the argument about 1.5 was always 1.5 to barely stay alive. Now, I say that because I think there's another important fact that we should always start with. Now, I presume everybody on this call has probably seen the champagne glass of climate emissions, right? You've all heard it. 10% of the world's population responsible for 50% of global emissions. Poorest 50% of the world only responsible for 10%. And that's a really, really, of course, important framing and anchor for all of our politics. But there's actually another champagne glass that you have to stand alongside it, because that only begins to tell us the full picture. And when you stand the champagne glass of global economic inequality, you see something really, really startling happen. First, you see that 10% of the world's richest citizens, own more than 50% of all global wealth. And the poorest 50% of the world's citizens own an average now of only 2% of global wealth. And their actual income each year is falling, whilst the richest people, their income is increasing. It's now 26 of the richest people own as much wealth as half the world's population. And this is a world where, we've already got existing glaring inequalities. We work with garment workers in Bangladesh and Sri Lanka, etc. And of course, the COVID pandemic has locked down much of the supply chains, and there's been huge issues about, garment workers now left destitute and without any income. But half the world's population, that's 3.5 billion people, already exist on less than $5 a day, right? So for them, the reality of the crisis is not something that's going to be new. And when we think about that, 3 billion of those people don't have access to energy, clean energy, electricity, or clean cooking. 1 billion people don't have access to water. 2 billion people go hungry. It says something about the world that we live in. And it's important to think about that, the world that we live in, because, unless we know where we're starting from, we're never going to be able to understand where we want to get to, or what we're trying to save. And often people say we have to save this planet and save what we've got, because what's around the corner is going to be terrible. And of course it is, but for many, many people, that reality, of course, is also really there. I want to say something else about just the climate science, just because you're all on here and I'm going to propagandize. One thing that you hear a lot about, of course, is all about this net zero that suddenly our government talks about, and lots of other people talk about. They add it to everything and say net zero. Just to say, the IPCC's models do include this thing called net zero, which is basically negative emissions technology, which is the idea you can pollute and then suck back the carbon out of the atmosphere. There is no proven technologies that are able to do that. The only technology that you can do that is bioenergy, carbon capture and storage. And for that, you require landmass 3 times bigger than India. And nowhere is that landmass exist, right? Apart from if you take land of the poorest and most marginal people. And that, I want to just say that because I think it gives you a sense of the urgency. And it gives a sense of the urgency as well when we talk about, when do we need to decarbonize? Because again, people think about this 2050 date and say the world has to decarbonize by 2050. In fact, rich countries need to decarbonize by 2030 to be able to poorer countries to be able to give them a bit longer to be able to deal with the impacts of both poverty and inequality, and also decarbonize. I always pose this question, what people think is the fair share that the UK, because of course we're often told the UK is a climate leader in climate negotiations, and how unlike the US we really take climate very, very seriously. If the UK was to do its fair share of effort, what it was responsible for, its fair share emissions would be minus 200% by 2030. That's how big of the carbon pie we've already consumed. And now we're going to consume even more. And of course, that's an impossibility. We can't get to minus 200. So it would require us to decarbonize as fast as possible by 2030, go 100%, and still transfer $1 trillion to the global south to do our fair share, not alone their own mitigation efforts. And again, I say that is because I think sometimes we fool ourselves about, what the scale of the reality and the responsibility in terms of the UK is. And so I'm sorry for boring you with the climate science. I always like to I think it's really important for us, because of the people we talk to and how we talk and how we anchor our politics, for us to know the glaring inequalities that are exposed by both the climate science and the climate realities. Now, I just wanted to say, so if that's all true, and often people say, wait a minute, if that's all true, how did we get here, right? Why didn't we act? We've been running climate campaigns since the 1970s. Why didn't governments act? It can't be simply that they just want to ignore the climate science. And I think the only way you can really understand how we get here is actually if you understand race and colonialism and capitalism. That if you understand that actually it's been not just something that's now in the present, in the past, but this idea of sacrificing the global south for the benefit of the global north is been built into our economies. You can go back all the way back to the doctrine of discovery, right? The doctrine of discovery signed by the kings and queens of Europe and the Pope, which basically said you could go anywhere in the world and you could claim those lands to be your territory, irrespective of the indigenous or people who lived there, because they had no inalienable right. And from that point, it creates this hierarchy of who has rights and who doesn't have rights. And we often talk about the Enlightenment in Europe, right? This moment of like liberty and equality, and this idea of this concept of breaking away from the Dark Ages into this new Enlightenment. And then, but look at the current of Enlightenment, and you listen to and read what Kant wrote about, the hierarchy of race, about the highest achievement in Enlightenment, and was about white citizens, and the lowest were black people who basically didn't have rights. And that begins to be codified in everything about our economies and our societies. This idea that you can sacrifice parts of the world and how you do it. And it's a scientific sort of study of racism and how it begins to be embedded. And I say that because, it has huge implications for us as a country and our economy, right? You can look back, for example, at slavery. And, between 1761 and 1808, British traders were responsible for 1,420,000 people of African descent who were enslaved and sold as slaves across the Atlantic. And they pocketed about 60 million pounds, right, which would be the equivalent of about 8 billion today. And and of course, those slave colonies, they supplied the UK with sugar and tobacco, and then later coffee and cotton and chocolate, and all part of the industrial input that made the British economy the 5th richest economy in the world. And when you think about, that moment, slave owners and merchants were some of the richest people in the country, and they used all those slave profits to build the very roads and factories and the great mansions and our great town halls that we now talk about as being part and parcel of the wealth of this country. And you can go and you say, Barclays Bank, founded by slave trade money. James Watt financed his whole, all of his scientific experiments were financed by slave profits. And it's estimated that each year in the 1700s onwards, British economy had about £4 million invested in it at the time. About 3.8 million of that came from slave profits. So you literally can say that slavery built every brick and mortar in this country. And that's the wealth of this country. And of course, even when slavery was finally abolished, and of course, we all told these lovely stories about William Wilberforce and how enlightened Britain was that it abolished slavery. Of course, it abolished slavery in the UK, largely actually as a result of huge popular campaigns by working class people, which I can talk about another time. But also, whilst it might abolish slavery here, it allowed slavery to continue in its colonies, and it allowed all those goods and commodities to come back in terms of the UK. And of course, when it abolished slavery, it paid compensation, and it didn't pay compensation to the slaves. It paid compensation to the slave owning merchants. In fact, we finally ended paying that debt in 2015 as taxpayers. So from the 1883 to 2015, all taxpayers were paying off this debt because we spent 40% of our national income on paying compensation to the richest people in the world. And I start with that story about slavery, and you might think, oh God, it's like a bit of a history lesson, why the hell is it relevant to this? Because I think until you understand the building blocks of how we get from slavery to colonialism, and what colonialism then also did to the global south, we can't understand, you know, the responsibility and the footprint of the UK economy. And just as I was speaking about of slavery, you know, I could tell you a story. I was born in Pakistan. I'm originally from the Indian subcontinent, and when Britain went to India and conquered India, you know, it's estimated, you know, that India's share of global GDP was about, you know, 34%. When they left, it was like less than 4%. But more important, they took out $45 trillion worth of wealth from India. It's said that Britain didn't spend a single penny on any of its wars or on its capitalist expansion to the colonies in New Zealand and Australia and Canada. All that finance came from the wealth that was taken out of its colonies in India, and of course similar amounts were taken out in terms of Africa and the Caribbean, etc. And and you know, and of course that's not just to talk about it as a historical fact, right? It's just to talk about and connect that this extraction of wealth and based on sacrificing both people and their environment has been an intrinsic part of how the British economy has grown. And, you know, it's not simply, again, about an historical fact about colonialism. We could talk about imperialism. I could talk to you about how in the 60s and 70s, when movements all around the global south, you know, rose up and tried to overthrow colonialism. You had liberation movements who were talking basically about, you know, we need these multinationals to get out of our country. We need to stop exploiting our natural resources. We want to invest in, you know, our public services and the right to health and education and housing for our people. And they wanted to try and control the extraction of their resources. And of course, we then, involved with the US and others, managed to overthrow many of those leaders. So Mossadegh in Iran, Lumumba in Congo, Allende in Guatemala. The history of movements and governments that have been overthrown simply because they tried to put a stop to the extraction of those resources and wealth. And, you know, if you look at it now, and it's not, again, an historical fact, we've got a report, it's called New Colonialism, which like estimates that just in the City of London, we have 101 companies who own £1 trillion worth of wealth, mineral wealth of Africa. That's more than the entire GDP of every sub-Saharan African country put together. And the wealth is owned by British and, of course, other global multinationals that are domiciled here in this country. And, you know, often again, we you know, the counter narrative we're told is, well, Britain's a very, very generous country, because that might have been terrible things, but now we're really, really good about aid. And again, just a really useful fact to know is, you know, in the last decade, if you include everything that flowed from the global north to the global south, and that's not just about in aid, but in all investment flows, in everything, all income coming, including remittances, it works out about $1.3 trillion. But flow from the global south to the global north to our banks is about 3.3 trillion. If you include it since 1980, for the global south has given the global north about 16 trillion in profit back to the global north. If you include the illicit tax flows, that's about another 13 trillion. If you include, you know, all the debt repayments that are being foisted on the global south, that's about another 4 to 5 trillion. It's an incredible extraction of wealth from the global south. And of course, it's left majority of the peoples in the world denied the right to a basic dignified life, denied the right to health, education, housing, the right to energy, the right to food, the right to water. And I say that because, you know, without understanding that, we can't understand, you know, what role capitalism and what role colonialism and what role race plays into how we get to this climate crisis. Not just, again, as I said, as an historical fact, but as something that is very real and very present. And, something that always struck me is that, you always read like when people do these like different numbers, and there's like one that if somebody was given £5,000 every day since the day Columbus, sailed out from Spain to discover a continent that was never lost, that person would still not be a billionaire. If they were given $5,000 every single day, they'd not be a billionaire. Yeah, Amazon makes that in 4 days. And in the midst of this corona pandemic, Amazon is making about $20,000 every single second. And the question about how they're able to do this is not simply about, how neoliberal capitalism has created a global financial architecture that empowers corporations to be able to access and resources at will. It's actually about how the implicit frame of our economies of the global north is built upon this idea of extracting wealth and surplus wealth from the labor of people in the global south through our supply chains, and of course through the exploitation of our natural resources. And that's important because, often again in our circles we talk about, the solutions that we face around, well, the answer to all of these things is Green New Deals. And for many of us who spent many decades finally arguing that, can we fucking put a stop to bloody climate change being about a white polar bear and a white iceberg, or the pictures of people in the global south up to their necks in water. These are totally dehumanizing images, but they're also depoliticizing images. They don't allow you to build power because we don't understand why we've got here in terms of the crisis. It's the polar bear is something that's abstract, it's out there, without understanding that actually we're only able to build the social power and the social license when we can move beyond the environment movement and connect our struggles to people fighting for economic and social justice. And of course, the Green New Deals do that a little bit, in the fact that they call for a living wage, they talk about investment in public service, etc. And that's really, really great. But what's interesting is, of course, is that most of the Green New Deals still replicate the same model of neoliberal extraction, right? Because they talk about they don't talk about material use. They don't talk about the scale of extraction that's required. It's now estimated that of the material that we currently use in the world, which is about 80 billion tons, when the sustainable amount is about 50, in the coming decades, we will have doubled that, but without delivering any sense of economic justice to the global south. It will simply be about building the economies of the global north. And, when we've breached the sustainable limit of what our planet can provide in the year 2000, it lends us to a big question then, when we're thinking about how we dial forward, what are we dialing forward to and from? So I would argue that without understanding that frame and without understanding that reality, all that we could potentially do is dial forward to a new form of green capitalism, right? A green capitalism that, yes, could transform our fossil-based economy to a renewable energy economy. It could do that. Of course, it can't, because we all know that it's impossible for us to, provide with renewable energy, no matter everything we do, to provide the kind of energy use that we have in a fossil-based economy. It requires us to think about actually what do we need energy for, and it requires us to start thinking about what is the economy for, and what is a sustainable economy, and what does living in a sustainable economy look like, and what is the level of consumption, and who pays, and who has the right to energy. Is it the billions of people who don't have access to energy who have the right to energy, or do we have the right to consume as much energy as we want? Those profound questions can only be understood and can only be answered if we begin to actually understand the economic model in which they operate. Because without understanding, connecting that economic model, there is a real danger, that our language and our frame is co-opted. Late last year, we were at BHP Billiton, a big mining giant. It's one of the biggest global mining companies in the world. And I was really struck. We had communities from Colombia and Brazil and Peru talking about the extraction that was being planned, huge mega mines that were being planned, for example, in Chile, which would take about 40% of all of the fresh water in one of the most drought impacted community areas, 6 million people about to be impacted. And for 40 years, the 40,000 tons of copper would be taken out. And the CEO of BHP Billiton said, that might be true, that there's going to be these environmental impacts, but we are central and key to the Green New Deal, to the green transformation. That's why we have to accept that there is going to be some people who are going to be impacted if we want to transform the global economy and transform our economies. And that, to me, really started to draw, again, the links. You can only say that if, of course, you're not the ones being impacted. We can only begin to be able to do that if, of course, we haven't got this logic of sacrificing the global south and building our economy on extraction of resources and in terms of people. And, you know, the OECD estimates that just on resource extraction, we would need to see about 150% increase in the rate of extraction of metals, about 135% increase in minerals. And of course, this new resource war, because it will be a new resource war, because there aren't enough rare earth minerals and metals, just on the current demand, this is not talking about demand that we expect in the rest of the world, just the current demand that is being talked about when people talk about, you know, well, every car will be electric batteries, you know, Britain will have 3 million electric cars. They're already talking about that that'll be, for cobalt, for example, will be about 423% of all known reserves. For lithium, it'll be about 280%. For nickel, about 136%. And all of these rare earth minerals and metals have huge environmental impact. If you look at where they're being taken out, if you look at Mongolia or Congo, they talk about those areas as being dead zones, right? Because nothing is able to either grow or survive. You pollute the water, you pollute the land, you pollute the air. It's devastating for the communities there. And again, we're told that this is necessary. It's necessary because in capitalism, and like in neoliberalism, we have to continue to grow. And that means we have to continue to extract more and more resources because we need, of course, to have profit accumulation. That's the very bedrock. So to think about the green future and think about how we dial forward, I think we need to start thinking about what is the alternative, right? What is the alternative? Because unless we do say that, unless we explicitly talk about why capitalism has failed to deliver for both people and planet, not as just a current thing, but historically, then we are potentially, of course, always in the danger to do that. And we can, right? We can see that the wealth of the world, now with the corona pandemic, and we talk about who's an essential worker and who isn't, we have a reality, right? The essential workers, the people who will keep the global economy working that are necessary, are not the bankers, right? And not the elites. They're the people who are in the lowest pay, the people who work in the supermarkets, the care sector. So our demands about how we deconstruct capitalism, of course, look, that doesn't mean you have to be an explicitly anti-capitalist, explicitly say that front and center, because I know the realities for many movements, and that's not how they frame or how they can talk. But our analysis has to be rooted in that anti-capitalist narrative. Because unless you do that, we can't get to the point where we say, so what are the solutions? The solutions aren't about simply talking about 100% renewable energy. They're actually talking about energy as a public good, owned by people, that the extraction has to be owned and put with limits, that we have to start talking about, you know, the kind of economy that we want. We have to start talking about, you know, a global living wage or guaranteed basic income. We have to start talking about universal public services, that everywhere in the world has the right to all of these. We have to talk about, you know, food as a right. I mean, it's incredible at this moment when we talk, you know, a couple of days ago, we had the government talking about our food supply chains and, of course, saying young people should go out in the fields and harvest this summer's crop because that's what's needed. But, you know, 80% of the world's population, you know, are fed by small farms, 80%. And they're fed on less than 24% of land. In Africa, it's even less, it's about 19%. And in some countries, it's 11%. The rest of the land, what's it for? It's for commodities to go to the global north. We've constructed economies that are all built on resources and commodities being sent to the global north. In fact, there is an incredible map, which maybe I'll send you at some point, which is a picture of Africa, colonial Africa, which was drawn up by the powers, Britain, France, Germany, etc. And they split up the continent of Africa, and of course they have the names of their colonial territories, but by them they put what commodity they want to grow there. Well, this area will be for coffee, this area will be for copper, this area will be for this. And if you put the same map now, you see exactly the same commodity flow from every one of those. So we have constructed states and economies in the global south to do nothing else but serve our own global economy. So I'm rattling on, so I'm going to stop. And I say all of those because at this moment, there's a lot of conversation about build back better, or, we need a just recovery, or we need a just transition. And all of those are really, really important. Of course they are. But unless they're framed in a global perspective, unless we start talking about actually we need a just recovery for the world, unless we start talking about we don't need just a just transition, actually we need a justice transition, unless we start talking about actually, the debt and the reparations that the global north owes to the global south, unless we start embedding all of these things, I think we'll miss this window. We will look back at it and say there was a moment, not just to transform and save our own economy, but actually to potentially to talk about dialing forward to something much, much better. And I think that's our big challenge now. Our big challenge is to make sure that we don't forget internationalism. And when we talk about internationalism, that internationalism is not about us passively providing some charity or some abstract form of solidarity. It's actually about building power in this country to transform our economy and take the foot of Britain off the rest of the world. And that's talking about our trade systems. It talks about our financial architecture. It talks about a global taxation system. And if all of that sounds a bit too radical, I'll just remind you, 71 years ago, people signed a document called the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And that Universal Declaration of Human Rights set out a number of things. It said, guarantee everybody in the world the right to a dignified life, the right to health and education and housing, the right to work and fair pay. These were all things that 71 years ago were set out and have never been realized because of neoliberal capitalism. We now have a moment, not only deconstruct neoliberal capitalism, but actually bring us, I think, to an eco-socialist future. I use that word, many others maybe have a different framing, but at least a sustainable economy that works for everyone. I'll shut up now.
Thank you so much for that. So that was so incredibly insightful and covered much more than the brief that we'd given you, I think. I hope we're all coming away from that feeling not just sort of more critically aware of our role within the environmental movement, but more aware as well as to what we can be doing going forwards to make others more aware. Got quite a few questions that have come in. Just to start you off on one, this comes from Chris. He's asking, how should groups organising for climate justice work to decolonize the movement, not just in our analysis, objectives and rhetorics, but also in our actions and practices?
Well, I think the first thing we can do, and this has always been a question from the Global South, right? The Global South movements back in the 80s and 90s would always ask this one question: where are the movements in the global north? And I remember being struck about, a year ago when Extinction Rebellion burst out on the scene, and I had all these messages from folks in the Global South movement, people saying, it's amazing, look at this, Britain's got a movement, it's out on the street. And then the next thing I had was like, why are they taking roads and bridges? Why aren't they going after the City of London, the banks and corporations? That's what's killing us. We're resisting, but the decisions are made in the City of London. Why aren't you targeting that? So that, I think, tells us about, it's not simply that we have to act, but what does acting look like in this moment? And what does solidarity look like? Well, solidarity looks like actually building and making sure that our interventions are in line with the demands of the Global South and are in demands aligned with the demands of movements in the Global South. I'll say to you, if you've got a moment, Google global campaign to demand climate justice. It's a mainly southern-based movement. We've just issued this huge, long statement about the kind of transformation that we wanted. We want the world at 1 degree is written by many people in the global movement, you know, about the realities of the climate crisis. And there are huge amounts of calls. You can sign up with War on Want. We have lots of calls from movements about what they would like us to do about targeting UK multinationals and the City of London. Look, 40% of all the mining giants in the world are domiciled here. You know, we're the second biggest mining exchange in the world. We're the second biggest financial center in the world. You know, we, if you want to say we're in the belly of the beast, we are in the belly of the beast. And there's a responsibility for us then to act about making sure we target the right things.
I would say we are the beast.
Absolutely, thank you, Asad. We've also had quite a few come through on the subject of reparations. I mean, how far do you agree with the statement that the only way for Britain to atone for historical injustices is not just through climate justice, but also through social justice, and we need to be paying generous reparations directly to the people and the government of the countries that we brutalised?
So absolutely, look, and there's been a historic movement for reparations, and there's been a historic movement for climate debt, for ecological debt. And one of the things, in fact, that we've been working at the moment is bringing many of those movements together and saying, you know, so what does transforming the global south look like, and what kind of finance is needed, right? Look, you know, the scale of money that is required for the global south to be able to have an alternative to dirty development is immense. And whilst these figures look huge, of course, this scale insignificance when we think we spent 13 trillion bailing out the banks, right? And that's partly why we did the fair shares. So you can Google UK fair shares, or I can send you a link where we actually estimated what that climate debt would look like just on the climate debt, that it would be $1 trillion in mitigation, forgetting what you would have, the UK would have to pay in adaptation, loss and damage. And these are huge numbers. And of course, when people talk about them, go like, oh my God, nobody's ever going to pay that amount of money. We're never going to get that kind of scale of money. Well, actually, part of it is about winning the argument that the global north owes the global south reparations and a debt, right? Because that moves us away from the charity frame, where we're doing this because we're lovely and we're going to give the global south 50 million or 100 million, blah, 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 blah. And you remember, all of these figures are plucked out of thin air, right? This, in the climate negotiations, is a thing that 100 billion for the climate finance. And Hillary Clinton 10 years ago at Copenhagen was looking for a figure and just said this number. Has no direct correlation with the needs. In fact, of the Paris Agreement, just in the Paris Agreement, which, as we know, is going to head us towards at least 3 degrees warming up to 7 degrees. The Global South pledges also require finance. And if you just calculate those, we're talking about something like about 3 trillion in that, just in the Paris pledges. But this doesn't mean that we, as in like, you know, ordinary people and ordinary citizens in the global north are paying the debt and reparations. I think we're talking much more about the wealth of the global elite, and we can talk about whether that's a wealth tax, where we can talk about whether that's, so Virgin and Richard Branson saying he wants a bailout. What about allowing some of these sectors to crash, not to put the workers out of work, but for us to basically, you know, for governments to buy them for £1, and then think about, you know, that the wealth of those multinationals, how can we begin to redistribute it back to the global south? So less from citizens and more from the profits and the dividends from these. But I think it's a really integral part. And again, it's part of moving the climate discourse away from when we used to talk about is climate change to now climate justice, to actually moving it to a frame of really connecting it with the broader frame of social justice.
Excellent, thank you so much. We've had a few questions as well revolving around the diversity of the Green movement itself. I mean, is it your opinion that the Green movement isn't itself diverse enough? Is there enough self-awareness in the movement? I mean, we always seem to be relying on the same 2 or 3 people of colour to host events like these and talk about things like this. Do you think that there's a role for political education to perhaps further the racial awareness of the movement itself?
Well, two things. I mean, one, historically, right through my involvement in various movements, I remember when I first came to the climate movement, and I genuinely, I could not see another person of color when I first. I mean, it was so rare, and of course, things are slightly better now. I take great hope from youth climate strikers, young Greens, etc. Way more diverse, way more diverse than we've ever been, that the climate movement has ever been before, and that definitely is a step forward. But when we say why is the Black community not been sort of interested in the environment movement, I talk a lot about that because actually we use frames which exclude people, right? The white polar bear, the white iceberg, etc. People in many movements in the global south, diaspora communities, have huge connections with their countries of origin. They understand issues much more in the frame of justice. So when we begin to make these connections, that's really important. Secondly, as a movement, we know you can only build power not by asking people to come to you, but going out to where people are and connecting with people's struggles. So what does radical climate activism look like in this country? Well, it looks more than just working on climate change. It actually means that we as a movement need to go out and start standing with migrant justice movements. We need to start building power with racial justice organizations. And then we begin to see this coming together. And I think we're way behind, some of the other countries. I mean, if you look at, for example, in the US has a much bigger, more vibrant people of color or Black climate justice movement. But that movement, wasn't in the mainstream. It came and it was organized totally separately. In fact, they wouldn't have anything originally to do with the mainstream environment movement, who they said were part and parcel of the same process of sacrificing the poorest and African American and Hispanic communities to environmental injustices in the US. And they were making much more solidarity directly with countries in the global south and with movements in the global south and building power with them. So I think there isn't a lack of people of color connected to what I would call the climate justice or broad economic justice, social justice. It's just that they're not necessarily present in the climate movement. And that's a bigger question. How are we organizing, and how do we organize that we're not able to draw people who are our natural allies into the, but of course, diversity is really, really important. But I also see in this new thing about a tick box, let's just have some brown or Black faces. That's okay. Well, to me, it's not simply about that diversity of skin tone. What we need is the politics. Because I'm sorry, but I'd much prefer, white working class. I have more solidarity with white working class young person and communities going through, issues in this country than I would have with, an elite middle class Black person whose reality is something completely different. So, to me, I think the intersectional approach of race, class, gender is really, really important when we talk about, the kind of movement we're building and the representation we have in this movement. But there's a lot of we're in a more positive moment than we've ever been before, because I'm telling you, try going on to climate marches like a decade ago or 15 years ago, and you would literally, you knew the other Black person who was on that march, right? You knew them, and that's how few there were. And to this day, when I used to head up Friends of the Earth International's work on climate, and I used to go to government meetings, and honestly I'd walk into meetings with the UK government and NGOs, and I couldn't tell the difference between who was working for an NGO and who was working for the government. Everybody looked alike, they talked alike, they shared the same jokes, they were actually, lots of them were in the same social circles. And so there is this thing about how elite we've made climate, and how climate was largely only organized through the lens of very, very big NGOs, which by themselves were, of course, obstacles to diversity. Now, I think there's more of a challenge. Youth climate strikers, for all its faults, people in Extinction Rebellion, and the various other movements that create Wretched of the Earth, etc.
I'm afraid we only have time for one more question, but what I wanted to finish on was one from Amy, who's asking, what can we as individuals or Young Greens do? I mean, to further some of the aims that you're talking about. We all feel, I think, a little bit powerless.
I think we should never feel powerless, because we are not powerless, right? We have power. The one thing that, you know, the elite, the powers that be, the one thing that they fear is our power. And we can only express our power when we organize collectively. So if nothing else, if you're a Young Green, then organize with the Young Greens. If you're in any other movement, organize, because that is the way to overcome our powerlessness, right? And we have to draw lessons, because no matter how powerless we individually feel, you know, collective power, you know, has transformed the world. Every social victory we've ever had, you know, right to vote, the right to join a trade union, the working week, ending apartheid, has never come from the top. It's come because we built powerful movements, and powerful movements are made of individuals. They decide where they're going to engage in their political activity, but they share a common analysis and frame. So what I would say, you know, one of the things we've got to spread is this political education. And I'm so happy that the Young Greens are doing all these webinars, because we have to be politically educated. We have to understand how the world is, and then we have to think about how we organize. And no matter where we are, we can organize, even if it means connecting with other people in their struggle, in struggles that might not necessarily be connected to climate. Because I'll tell you what, the one thing you learn about community organizing is people will only come to you when you've gone to them, will only come to you and work with you when they trust you. How do you build trust? How do you build those links? You build them by going to where people are and seeing what their fight is and getting involved in that. And that, I think, is a really critical lesson of movements everywhere in the world. And I want to end just on one story about powerlessness and power. There's a place in Colombia called Cerrejón. Probably a lot of people have heard about it. It's a big coal mine down there, and huge extractives in this part of the world. And in one of the communities there was going to have this huge mine come in. In fact, the mine had the support of the government. They went there and they said, we're going to promise to build you roads and houses and hospitals if you say yes to this mine. And the local community said, no, we don't want it. Paramilitaries came in and said, anybody who organizes against this mine, we will kill. People organized, they executed and disappeared the community leaders, mainly women who organized that community. The community organized their own popular referendum. 97% of people voted against that mining company. On the basis of that one community, 19 other communities took on popular referendum and voted against mining companies being allowed into their territories. That's the power of individuals coming together to build collective power. So never feel powerless. We have immense power. It's how we use it that matters.
Thank you so much, Asad. That was an incredibly inspiring talk, and I hope that we're all coming away from that with a little bit of a clearer idea as to what we can do to help further the movement. I'm just going to feed back to Rosie for a second, who I know has a little ask to make of us all.
Thank you so much, Asad. That was incredible. Like, I mean, we're all applauding, and all of the chat, we can see how much people have enjoyed this. So it's been incredible to have you, and thanks, Annette, for hosting. I can't believe that, I mean, we should just have Asad on every week, and so many of our speakers, it's always so tight in an hour, but we have got so much more coming up, and in talking about that kind of building of power, we're not only delivering this list of talks that we've got coming up, but also some of you may have at the very start of this attended our press and media training with Natalie Bennett, which was a 2-hour intensive training session to try and build our power, build our skills at this time when we're feeling kind of locked down. And we've got more of those to come. We've got digital organising training, we've got campaigns organiser training, we've got local elections organiser training as well. So there's a whole list to come. We're this week going to be announcing what's coming up in May. But the very next one that we'd love for you all to come to is Maxon Brown, who has been on some of these calls, but I can't see if he's here today. But he's one of our very own Young Green activists and also a climate strike organiser who has like so much to tell us about where the school strike movement is going. We'd love for you to join. I think that, yeah, Nanette has just posted it. Oh, it's so good. I don't have to click. So Nanette just posted that link. Please do register. We'd love to see you on Thursday evening after the Clap for Carers at 8:05. And then the other thing that we did just say as well, that Nanette will stick in, if you want to see more of this, please do chuck us £2 a month to help make it happen. It would go so far and mean so much to us. And if you did enjoy it, I can see you enjoyed it because I seen you write it in the chat. So if you would like to share how your thrill and enjoyment, and it was the best week, the best night of your week, it's the Monday, so, but yeah, please do share this. We've got a click to tweet, which, as I always say, is like us putting words into your mouth, but you can edit this. If you follow the link that Nanette has just posted, you'll be able to see a pre-filled tweet, which means that it will say, oh, fantastic event with Asad, I'm going to miss it. But I'm really excited about what's coming up. The Young Greens are hosting all these events, and the next one is on Thursday, but in less characters and some emojis. So yeah, that's what's coming up. We'd love you to share that, but thank